What would you do if a wild mother bear appeared at your doorstep, desperate, silent, and carrying something in her jaws? Would you turn away or open your heart to the unknown? In the stillness of a forested Vermont night, one elderly woman faced that very question. What happened next would ripple through her quiet life in ways no one could imagine. This is a tale of trust, healing, and nature's quiet miracles. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And now, our story begins. The air hung thick and unmoving, a blanket of summer heat that even the dense trees surrounding Margaret's cabin could not soften. It was one of those rare Vermont nights when the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. The usual chorus of crickets had quieted, and even the wind had abandoned its place among the pines. In her small, time-worn cabin nestled at the edge of the northern woods, Margaret sat in her rocking chair by the open window, a glass of lukewarm lemonade at her side, and a paperback novel she'd read 3 times resting on her lap. The old fan in the corner whirred and clicked with every rotation, doing little more than stirring the thick air. At 82, Margaret had grown used to the silence that came with solitude. It wasn't a lonely silence, not really. It was a familiar kind, stitched together from years of quiet dinners, slow walks to the garden, and letters never sent to the husband who'd left the world 3 winters ago. The cabin, with its knotty pine walls and oil lamp glow, had become a place of memory more than expectation. So when the sound came, so soft it could have been a trick of the trees, Margaret paused, her heart tapping a little faster in her chest. A scratching, subtle, slow, not at the window, but the door. It wasn't the confident knock of a neighbor, nor the eager thump of a dog's paw. This was different. Tentative, careful, Margaret set her book aside, her fingers lingering over the worn cover, and stood slowly. Her knees, stiff from age and humidity, creaked as she crossed the wooden floor. The porch light was out, the bulb long dead, but the moon cast a pale wash of silver over the stoop. She reached for the door's latch with a mix of curiosity and caution. Perhaps a raccoon, she thought, or a deer. It wouldn't have been the first time a creature from the woods had wandered close, but something in her gut, the part that had once warned her to fetch her husband in the storm before the roof caved in, the part that had known when her son was lying about that car accident, told her this was different. When she opened the door, the world stood still. At first, she didn't see anything, just the night and the hush of pine needles swaying faintly in the trees. Then, a movement, low, slow, deliberate. Her eyes adjusted, and her breath caught. There, at the edge of the porch, stood a bear. A mother, unmistakably, her dark, ragged fur clinging to ribs too visible. Her head lowered with an exhaustion that was somehow human in its honesty. But what truly undid Margaret was what the bear held gently in her jaws, a cub, limp and panting. Its small body twitched weakly with a kind of fever that screamed urgency. Margaret didn't move, not out of fear, but from a sense that any sudden action might break the fragile spell holding this moment together. The bear's eyes met hers, and Margaret felt an emotion pass between them. Not wildness, not threat, but something closer to pleading. The cub let out a faint, raspy sound, barely audible over the chirp of a single cicada nearby. The world offered Margaret a choice. She took a breath and stepped aside. As if understanding, the mother bear eased forward, her massive frame nearly brushing the doorframe. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each paw landing with a weight that seemed measured by trust. She set the cub down gently just inside the threshold, then retreated 2 steps back, watching. Margaret dropped to her knees, her old joints protesting, and leaned in to examine the small creature. The cub's breath came in short, desperate huffs. Its fur, once a bright cinnamon brown, was now dulled with heat and weakness. Margaret reached out with a trembling hand, brushing its forehead. Her touch came instinctively, cool, practiced. Her mind flashed back 60 years to a field hospital she'd worked in during her training, long before she chose marriage and forest life over medicine. A child with a fever, lying on a cot in Saigon. She remembered the smell of camphor and the warmth of compresses in metal bowls. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice cracking as it hadn't in years. She moved quickly then, her old body fueled by something primal. She retrieved a basin from the kitchen, filled it with cool well water, and tore strips from an old linen sheet she kept in a drawer for preserving herbs. The bear remained outside, unmoving, watching through the open doorway. Margaret worked in silence, wiping the cub's small body, checking for wounds, feeling its pulse, faint but there. She mashed together a poultice of feverfew and goldenrod herbs she'd gathered just days before, her hands steady even as her heart trembled. She applied it to the cub's chest and forehead. She murmured old lullabies under her breath, the ones she'd once sung to her own baby boy, now grown and living oceans away. Time bent around her, the minutes stretching like warm molasses. She lost track of the hour. At some point, the mother bear gave a low chuff, then turned and disappeared into the darkness beyond the porch. Not with urgency, but with something more like trust, leaving her child in the care of someone she somehow understood would not fail her. By dawn, the fever had not broken, but the cub's breathing had steadied. Margaret had stayed beside him all night, her back sore from the hardwood floor, her hand never leaving the tiny, heaving chest. The window now glowed with the soft amber of morning, and outside, a few birds dared to break the silence with tentative chirps. The world was beginning to turn again. She looked down at the cub, and with a weary smile whispered, "I suppose we'll need to get you a name." Then her gaze shifted to the doorway, where muddy paw prints faded into the mist of the trees. The bear would be back. She knew it as surely as she knew the sun would rise again tomorrow. But for now, there was just the cub, the cabin, and a quiet, impossible truth taking root in the heart of a woman who thought she had already seen all the miracles life had to offer. She hadn't. Not yet. Margaret didn't sleep that first night. Not a single blink. Her bones ached from kneeling so long on the hard floor, and her neck was stiff from hunching over the cub. But none of that mattered. Not when the small bear was still alive. Each time its breath caught or rattled in its chest, her own lungs held still in fearful sympathy, only exhaling when it settled again. Morning came slowly, seeping through the thin linen curtains like gold diluted in milk. The cabin, dim and cool, felt changed, not in some dramatic supernatural way, but in a quiet, reverent shift, like how a chapel feels different just before a wedding. Margaret rose carefully and placed the back of her hand against the cub's forehead. Still warm, but not as hot as before. That gave her a flicker of hope. She took that flicker and built a plan around it. She'd keep the cub cool and hydrated, continue applying the herbal poultices every few hours, and, if needed, try to mix in crushed willow bark, nature's aspirin. Her mind, though slowed with age, began to churn with the precision of her long medical training. She scribbled down notes on the back of an old seed catalog, tracking temperature changes and symptoms. It gave her something to do with her hands, something more than just worry. Every so often, her gaze drifted toward the doorway. The mother bear had disappeared into the forest after delivering her sick child to the doorstep, and part of Margaret wondered if she would return at all. But deep down, she already knew that kind of love doesn't just vanish. And she was right. Just before noon, a rustle in the underbrush drew her to the window. There, at the tree line, was the mother. She didn't come close, didn't step onto the porch, but she was there, sitting back on her haunches, head tilted slightly as if listening. Margaret opened the door slowly, letting the screen creak as it always had, and called out softly, "He's still with us." The bear didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there breathing, watching. "I don't know if you can understand," Margaret added, her voice gentle, "but I'm trying. I'll do what I can." Then, as if satisfied, the bear turned and disappeared again between the pines, vanishing without a sound. That became their rhythm. Each morning, the mother would appear, never crossing the porch, never venturing too close. She'd stay for an hour or two, sometimes pacing the edge of the woods, sometimes lying down in the shadows, her dark shape barely distinguishable from the earth and roots. Then she'd vanish again, likely in search of food or water, only to return the next day. Margaret came to expect her visits the way one expects sunrise, constant, reassuring, and somehow necessary to keep the world turning. The cub, whom Margaret had begun calling Ash for the smudge-like mark on his nose, grew stronger by the day. He was too weak to stand at first, but his eyes began to follow her movements, and he whimpered when she left the room, as if sensing she was his lifeline now. She spoon-fed him a mixture of honey water and foraged berries mashed into a paste, dribbling it into his mouth while stroking the soft down of his fur. He was smaller than most cubs his age should have been, but there was fire there, a stubborn threat of life unwilling to let go. By the end of the week, Ash managed to sit up for short stretches, blinking sleepily and leaning heavily against the rolled towel she had placed at his side. Margaret took to humming while she worked, old melodies from her youth, war songs and lullabies, church hymns and folk tunes her grandmother used to sing on wash days. The music seemed to soothe them both. On the 8th day, Ash tried to stand. He wobbled like a drunkard, paws spread wide, claws sliding against the wood floor, but he made it upright for a full heartbeat before tumbling onto his side. Margaret clapped once, a soft laugh slipping from her mouth, and Ash blinked at her in surprise, then let out a noise that almost sounded like a grumble. "You'll get there," she said, kneeling beside him. "One step at a time, little man." Summer rolled on in slow, golden waves. The heat never quite broke, and the cicadas sang relentlessly from the trees. Inside the cabin, Margaret rearranged her furniture, moving the rocking chair into the corner and laying down a quilt over the floor to give Ash more grip. She opened the windows at night to cool the space, sometimes sleeping on the couch to stay close to him. It was strange, she thought more than once, how easily she'd let a wild animal take over her home. How naturally she'd accepted this new reality. But it didn't feel like intrusion. It felt like purpose. The quiet she'd once protected so fiercely now felt too brittle, too empty. Ash gave it weight again, rhythm, breath. By mid-August, Ash was walking steadily. He'd grown considerably, eating twice as much and sleeping longer stretches. He played with her woven rug, tugging at the tassels with his teeth, and once tried to climb into the wood bin, toppling the logs with a loud crash that made both of them jump. Margaret had scolded him gently, then laughed so hard she had to sit down. That night, the mother bear came closer than ever. She stepped onto the porch cautiously and sat directly in front of the screen door. Margaret, her hands trembling just slightly, stepped up and met her gaze from behind the mesh. "He's doing well," she said, nodding toward the cub, asleep near the hearth. The bear's ears flicked forward, and then, just for a moment, she dipped her head. It wasn't human gratitude. It didn't need to be. Margaret stood there long after the bear had returned to the woods, her chest aching with something deeper than joy. It was reverence, she realized, the feeling of being trusted by something wild, of being part of a story larger than herself. She whispered into the stillness, "Thank you for letting me help." And the forest answered with silence, and that silence felt holy. The days slipped by like leaves on a slow-moving river, each one edged with the quiet miracle of something once broken, growing whole again. Ash had begun to explore the cabin on his own, his little paws patting softly over the creaky wooden floors. He'd nosed his way into the pantry twice, knocking over a tin of oats and a basket of potatoes before Margaret realized the latch would need reinforcing. She hadn't minded. The mischief was a sign of strength. Each tumble, each curious glance, was proof that life had returned to his limbs. The mother bear's visits became clockwork, dawn and dusk, always at the edge of the trees, sometimes with bits of moss stuck in her fur, once with a fresh fish clamped gently between her teeth. Margaret had stepped out that morning, drawn by the low rustle of movement, and found the fish laid neatly at the edge of the porch, like an offering. She hadn't dared touch it at first. The meaning was too tender, too wild. It felt like communion. But later that day, after gutting and cleaning it with careful hands, she fed the softest parts to Ash in a bowl by the fire, and he devoured it greedily, his black eyes shining with new energy. She glanced toward the window more than once that evening, half expecting the mother to be watching, but saw nothing but trees swaying in the orange light of a fading sun. Margaret began talking to the bears, not as one talks to pets, but like one speaks to ghosts or gods. Her words were simple, often drifting out into the trees as she hung laundry or tended to her garden. "The fever's gone," she would say, or, "He took 3 steps on his hind legs today." Sometimes she would share stories from her past, the time she and her husband tried to build a canoe and nearly sank it in the river, or how she once danced barefoot in the rain during a thunderstorm just to remember what it was like to feel wild. She didn't expect answers. It wasn't that kind of conversation. But the act of speaking aloud, of being heard, even if only by the pines and the birds and perhaps something just beyond the tree line, soothed the ache that had settled in her bones since widowhood. Ash grew quickly. His legs thickened, his movements steadied. No longer a fragile creature trembling at the edge of death, he now romped around the cabin like a child testing the edges of his world. Margaret led him through, moving breakable things to higher shelves and replacing her favorite rug with an old one too threadbare to mind a few claw marks. She taught him boundaries gently, with claps and shushes, and once a wooden spoon tapped against the floor when he got too bold with her knitting basket. He responded not with fear but curiosity, as though the world, this strange wooden den filled with the scent of sage, smoke, and soup, was something worth learning. By the first rains of autumn, Ash could no longer fit through the back door without ducking. Margaret took to leaving it open during the day, letting the breeze move freely through the house, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and pine. The mother bear came closer now, drawn perhaps by Ash's scent or the simple understanding that this was no longer just Margaret's cabin. It was a den shared by something wilder. One evening, just as twilight pulled blue and soft beneath the trees, the mother bear approached the porch and laid down beside the steps. Margaret sat nearby in her rocker, knitting half a scarf she wasn't sure anyone would wear. Ash lay between them, his head on his paws, eyes fluttering shut. And in that quiet triangle of woman, cub, and mother, something ancient and sacred settled. Trust, unspoken and unforced, pulsed between them like the rhythm of a shared heartbeat. That night, After the bears had gone and the fire had dimmed to a soft orange glow, Margaret sat at her writing desk, a place she rarely visited anymore. She pulled out a yellowed notepad and began writing a letter to her late husband. "Dearest Paul," she wrote, her pen trembling slightly. "I don't think you'd believe what's happened here. Then again, maybe you would. You always said the forest had secrets. You were right." She paused, staring at the flicker of candlelight. "They trust me, Paul. These bears, the mother especially. She watches me like you used to. Quietly, like she's memorizing everything in case it's the last time. And the cub? I don't know what to say except that I think he's healing me just as much as I'm healing him." She stopped writing then, her hand resting gently on the page, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had unfolded in the past months. She wasn't alone anymore. Not in the way she'd feared she would be in the years after Paul passed. She hadn't filled the void with people or plans or television noise. She'd filled it with something real, something ancient. And in return, the forest had given her purpose. Not in a loud, grand way, but in the daily ritual of care, in the flick of Ash's ears when she spoke, in the silent company of his mother just beyond the porch. The next morning, she awoke to find fresh paw prints in the mud and 2 pine cones placed neatly by the doorstep. She bent to pick one up and noticed it had been stripped carefully of all but its core, a gesture, perhaps, a gift. She placed it on the windowsill beside her favorite photograph of Paul, who now seemed to smile a little wider in the frame. The days would shorten soon. Winter would come. But Margaret felt no fear. Not this year. Something had changed. The forest had accepted her, and in turn, she had learned its quiet language, the language of trust without words, of presence over promise. And somewhere deep in her soul, she knew this season was not just a passing chapter. It was the beginning of something neither she nor the bears would forget. Autumn bled slowly into the edges of the trees, brushing the leaves with golden fire. The forest that had hummed with thick green life through summer now exhaled a different kind of music, drier, crisper, edged with the rustling promise of winter's approach. Margaret could feel it in her joints before she saw it in the branches, the way old pain reawakened like a forgotten bell rung somewhere deep within. She added a second log to the fireplace in the mornings now, and when she walked into town for flour or tea, she wrapped her scarf twice around her neck instead of once. The world was shifting, and so was Ash. He had grown tall, not quite full bear, but close. He no longer fit easily inside the cabin. His head brushed against hanging pots, and his paws, once no bigger than a biscuit tin, now thudded against the floorboards with real weight. His energy had changed too. There was still a softness in him, a curiosity that hadn't dimmed, but it was layered now beneath something else, an edge of restlessness, a readiness that had taken root in his bones. Margaret saw it when he paced the porch in the early morning hours, eyes fixed on the trees, ears twitching at sounds she couldn't hear. He still nuzzled her hand and settled beside her in the evenings, but there was distance in him now, like he was slowly waking up from a dream that had kept him here. And she knew, even before it happened, that the forest would take him back. The mother bear had been returning less frequently. Where once she sat at the tree line twice a day without fail, now there were mornings and evenings when she did not come. On the day she did, she didn't linger. She would watch for a few minutes, sometimes giving a low rumble that Ash responded to with a tilt of his head, and then she would melt back into the forest. Margaret didn't blame her. It was nature's way. But the space she left behind felt larger than it should have, like a door being slowly, deliberately closed. One morning, in late October, frost thick on the grass and her breath clouding in the chill, Margaret stood at the edge of the porch with a mug of tea wrapped in both hands. Ash was in the yard, his massive shoulders rolling beneath his fur as he sniffed at the wind. The mother bear appeared from between the trees, slow and silent. Margaret froze, not out of fear, but recognition. Something was different. The mother stepped forward, not just to the porch but onto it, close enough that the boards creaked beneath her weight. Ash turned, and a deep sound passed between them, part groan, part sigh. The mother bumped her snout against his shoulder, then looked at Margaret. For one long moment, the woman and the bear regarded one another, not as enemies, not even as strangers, but as mothers, as guardians, as two beings who had loved the same child in different ways. Then, without another sound, the mother bear turned and walked away, slow and deliberate. Ash hesitated, his eyes flicking between the retreating shape and Margaret. She gave him a small nod, her lips trembling but her spine straight. "Go on then," she whispered. "It's time." Ash turned to her, pressed his large head against her chest, and stayed there for a breath. "Just one." She laid a hand on his thick neck, fingers splayed wide. "You were never mine to keep," she murmured, blinking rapidly. "But I'm glad you stayed as long as you did." Then he turned, followed his mother, and disappeared between the trees without looking back. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace but of absence. It settled over the cabin like snow, quiet and thick and strangely loud in its stillness. Margaret stood alone on the porch, the tea in her hands now cold. And for the first time in many months, the cabin behind her felt too big again. That evening, she lit every lamp in the house. It was a foolish thing, wasteful even. But she couldn't stand the dark. She baked bread even though she wasn't hungry. She knitted furiously, though her fingers ached. She left the back door open for hours just in case. But the wind brought no familiar scent, no soft padding footsteps, no shape against the tree line. Only the moon, rising cold and indifferent, bathed the cabin in pale light. In the following days, Margaret adjusted in small, invisible ways. She stopped setting out a second bowl of food. She closed the back door earlier. She folded the quilt Ash had ruined with his claws and placed it in the chest beneath her bed. Unsure if she was preserving it or hiding it, the house grew quiet again. Not empty, she'd lived alone too long to call it that, but quieter than it had been. The quiet of something that had bloomed and then been gently taken away. Winter came earlier than expected, brushing snow over the pine branches and icing the windows in the mornings. Margaret spent more time by the fire, rereading her favorite novels and writing long letters to her husband in her journal. She told him about Ash's leaving, about the stillness that had followed. She told him she didn't cry, not then, but she cried now as she wrote it. She told him she wasn't sad, not really, just undone. As if some piece of her that had only just started to heal had been peeled open again, but gently, respectfully, like the forest was reminding her that healing doesn't always mean keeping. That sometimes loving means letting go. She didn't expect to see them again. That's not how the wild works. When a bear leaves, it leaves. And Margaret, though her heart longed otherwise, respected that. She had given all she could, and she had been given more in return than she ever imagined. Still, sometimes, when the wind whispered through the chimney just so, she would pause her knitting and listen. Not with hope exactly, not even with expectation, but with memory. The kind that lives not in the mind but in the chest, the kind that aches quietly when the snow begins to fall. The cabin stood shrouded in the hush of winter, its roof dressed in a thick quilt of snow, and icicles draping like crystal teeth from the eaves. A faint plume of smoke curled from the chimney, rising into the pale blue sky, while inside, the hearth burned steadily, casting its amber glow across the familiar wooden walls. It was the morning of Margaret's 83rd birthday, though she'd made no mention of it to anyone. Not even in the letter she still wrote to Paul each week. She'd never been one to fuss about her age, and since his passing, birthdays had come and gone like fallen leaves, quiet, solitary, nothing more than another mark in the calendar she kept by the stove. She had baked herself a small honey cake the night before, not out of celebration, but habit, something warm to have with tea. She had wrapped it in cloth and placed it on the windowsill to cool, then forgot about it until well after dusk. By the time she remembered, it had gone a bit stale on the edges, but she smiled to herself and thought, well, stale cake still makes for good company. The morning passed slowly, each hour stretching long and thin. She fed the birds, brushed the snow from the steps, then settled into her rocker by the fire with a half-finished scarf in her lap. The needles clicked softly in her hands, a rhythmic conversation between wool and wood. And outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper she couldn't quite catch. She wasn't lonely, not exactly. Not in the way she'd been before Ash came. That kind of loneliness, the deep, aching kind that made her forget the sound of her own voice, had left her in the spring. In its place, a quieter solitude had grown, softer at the edges, shaped by memory and something else she hadn't yet named. She found herself talking to the air again. Little things like, I think the juncos are early this year, or, the stove's burning too fast today. Just as she'd done when Ash used to lie by the fire, those dark eyes watching her like he understood every word. She missed him, of course. She missed the way he would curl into the corner of the rug, the way he grumbled when she swept too close, the warm weight of him just being there. But she had accepted his absence, had come to terms with the fact that the wild had reclaimed what was never truly hers. She thought of him now and then, especially on cold nights, but with a kind of gentle pride, like a mother thinking of a child gone off into the world to live their own life. It was just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the knock came. Not a knock exactly, more like a sound pressed against the edge of silence, so faint it could have been the shifting of snow or the creak of a tree branch. But Margaret knew better. She rose slowly, her knees stiff, and set her knitting aside. The wind had picked up, curling against the windows, and for a moment she hesitated at the door, hand hovering over the latch. Her heart, usually so quiet, had begun to thump in a way it hadn't in months. She opened the door. At first, there was only the brightness of snow, the hush of trees bowed under their icy burdens. But then she saw them. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the line of birch and spruce, were 2 bears. The larger one, she knew instantly. The mother, older now, her fur silvered around the muzzle, her posture still regal, still rooted in something ancient and strong. But it was the other that undid Margaret. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his coat thick and shining with health. And though his size had tripled since she last saw him, she knew him. Knew the curve of his ears, the way his right paw turned slightly outward, the ash-gray mark that still streaked his nose like a fingerprint from the past. Ash. Her Ash. Her voice caught in her throat, not from shock, but from the sudden aching fullness of 100 quiet days finally blooming into something too big to hold inside. She stepped onto the porch barefoot without realizing it, the cold stinging her toes. Ash took 1 step forward, then another, slow and deliberate. The mother bear stayed back, watching, and then just behind Ash, a smaller figure appeared, wobbly, wide-eyed, its fur still fluffy with youth. A cub. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, tears springing hot and fast. Ash turned to nudge the little one forward gently with his nose, and the cub bounded a few awkward steps through the snow before flopping into a heap, squeaking in protest. Ash let out a deep huffing breath, almost a laugh, and looked back at Margaret. She laughed too, her voice breaking like spring ice. "You brought him to meet me," she whispered. "Oh, my sweet boy." She didn't step forward. She didn't need to. This moment wasn't meant for touch. It was meant for seeing, for knowing, for saying without words what hearts had held in silence for months. The cub struggled upright and waddled a few feet closer to the porch before plopping down again, curling into a small ball of fur with a soundless yawn. Ash sat beside him, massive and calm, his dark eyes fixed on Margaret. They stayed like that for a while, the three bears and the old woman in the snow-hushed world, suspended in a peace too profound for language. Margaret didn't speak again, but she nodded once, slowly, and Ash blinked, as if in answer. Then, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, painting the snow in a soft wash of rose and gold, Ash rose and gently nudged his cub awake. The little one shook itself like a dandelion puff and trotted back to its grandmother's side. Together, the bears turned, disappearing one by one into the trees, their shadows long and beautiful against the last light of day. Margaret stood on the porch long after they were gone, her arms wrapped around herself, not for warmth, but to hold in the fierce trembling joy that had burst in her chest. She went inside eventually, closing the door behind her with care, and returned to the fire. The scarf sat unfinished on her chair, her knitting needles resting where she'd left them. But she didn't sit. Instead, she opened the cupboard, took down the honey cake, and placed it on a plate. Then she lit a second candle, set it beside the flame already dancing on the mantel, and whispered into the golden hush, "Happy birthday to me." The room felt full again, not with sound, but with presence, with memory, with love returned. And as the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall softly outside, Margaret leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and smiled. Somewhere out there, the forest had remembered her.